Good afternoon, everyone. Today, let me start with something most people never realize. You can lose weight, see the number on the scale go down, watch your clothes get looser, and still be very sick on the inside. That's because not all fat is the same. The fat you can see in the mirror is not the fat that worries me the most as a cardiologist. What concerns me deeply is the fat you cannot see at all. That fat is called visceral fat. Visceral fat does not sit politely under the skin. It wraps itself around your vital organs, the liver, the pancreas, the intestines, even the heart. You can be thin on the outside and still have a dangerous amount of visceral fat on the inside. I've seen it over and over again in my practice. Patients come in shocked when their scans show fatty liver, inflamed organs, and calcified arteries, even though they don't look overweight. And here's the key insight. Visceral fat is not passive storage. It is not just excess calories, sitting there doing nothing. Visceral fat is an active endocrine organ. It behaves like a rogue government inside your body, constantly releasing chemical signals that influence inflammation, insulin resistance, blood pressure, cholesterol, and even cancer risk. When visceral fat is dominant, your biology is under hostile management. This is why losing visceral fat is not a cosmetic victory. It is an internal biological rebuild. When visceral fat finally starts to break down, the body doesn't just look different. It begins to function differently at a cellular, hormonal, and metabolic level. Before I start today's informative lecture, I just have a small request. If you're new, what visceral fat really is and why it's different to my YouTube channel, make sure you hit that red subscribe button. It will motivate me to create more lectures for you. Now, for years we were told that fat was just about calories. Eat less, move more. But that model completely ignores how fat behaves, especially visceral fat. Visceral fat releases inflammatory cytokines like interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha. It drives insulin resistance. It disrupts leptin signaling so your brain never gets the message that you're full. It pushes cortisol higher, keeping your body in a chronic stress state. This is why visceral fat is strongly linked to heart disease, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, dementia, autoimmune disorders, and yes, even cancer. Chronic inflammation is the soil in which disease grows. And visceral fat is one of the most potent sources of that inflammation. Now, here's the hopeful part. When visceral fat starts to break down, everything changes, but not all at once. It follows a very specific biological sequence. The body does not randomly burn visceral fat. It does so only when the hormonal environment is right. That means insulin has to fall. That means energy has to become scarce enough that the body is forced to tap into its internal reserves. This is where fasting, metabolic rhythm, sleep, and stress control enter the picture. Visceral fat is highly sensitive to hormonal signals. When those signals shift, visceral fat is often the first fat to become metabolically active and also the most transformative to lose. In this series, I want to walk you through exactly what happens when visceral fat finally starts to break down, step by step, organ by organ, hormone by hormone, not with hype, but with physiology. Because once you understand what visceral fat really is, you'll stop chasing weight loss and start pursuing actual metabolic health. Now, the breakdown of visceral fat does not begin with exercise, and it does not begin with calorie counting. It begins with a signal, a very specific signal that tells the body energy is no longer coming in from the outside. You must now rely on what you have stored. That signal is the fall of insulin. As long as insulin remains elevated, visceral fat is protected. Insulin is a storage, while visceral fat is biologically dangerous hormone. Its job is to preserve energy, not release it. When insulin is high, fat is locked away, especially the visceral fat that surrounds your organs. This is why many people can diet, exercise, and still fail to lose visceral fat. They are fighting biology while insulin remains in command. When insulin finally drops, the message changes. The body shifts from storage mode to access mode. This is when visceral fat becomes metabolically active. Think of visceral fat as a high-security energy vault. It only opens when the hormonal password is correct. Once that vault opens, free fatty acids begin to pour into the bloodstream. These fats are not randomly distributed. They are delivered directly to organs that desperately need metabolic relief, starting with the liver. The liver is the metabolic headquarters of the body. When visceral fat surrounds it, the liver becomes inflamed, insulin resistant, and overloaded with fat. This is what we call fatty liver disease, and it is one of the most underappreciated drivers of metabolic illness. When visceral fat starts breaking down, the liver finally gets a chance to clear itself, As free fatty acids are mobilized, the liver begins converting them into ketones. This is not a pathological process. This is a deeply evolutionary one. Ketones are a clean, efficient fuel. They reduce oxidative stress. They calm inflammation. They provide stable energy to the brain and heart. At the same time, inflammatory signals begin to fall. Interleukin 6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha start to decrease. This is not subtle. I've seen inflammatory markers drop dramatically in patients who haven't lost much weight yet, but have clearly begun mobilizing visceral fat. The blood tests change before the mirror does. As inflammation quiets down, insulin sensitivity improves. Muscles begin responding to insulin again, the pancreas gets relief, blood sugar stabilizes, leptin signaling improves, which means your brain finally starts recognizing satiety, you feel full sooner, cravings begin to loosen their grip, cortisol, the stress hormone, also begins to normalize. Visceral fat thrives in a stress-driven environment. When cortisol is chronically elevated, fat is preferentially stored around the organs. As metabolic stress decreases, cortisol. The biggest myth about calories and fat loss falls, and the cycle begins to reverse. This is why visceral fat loss feels different from regular weight loss. People often tell me they feel calmer, their thinking becomes clearer, their energy steadier, their sleep deeper. These are not coincidences, these are signs that the internal hormonal environment is being repaired. And here's something important. The body prioritizes visceral fat because it is dangerous. From a survival standpoint, visceral fat is metabolically toxic. When given the right conditions, the body is eager to get rid of it, but those conditions must be hormonal, not forceful. You cannot bully visceral fat away. You must change the internal environment so the body willingly dismantles it. If you're still here with me, just comment below the word "Yes, Doctor," and I'll know how many of you are still attending the lecture. And if you're finding this lecture informative so far, please hit that like button and leave me a subscribe on this channel. Now, I want to talk about what happens beyond the liver, because once visceral fat starts to shrink, the benefits ripple outward to the gut, the brain, and even the immune system. Once visceral fat begins to break down and the liver starts to recover, the effects don't stay confined to metabolism alone. They spread outward like a city regaining order after years of dysfunction. One of the next systems to feel the impact is the gut. Visceral fat and gut health are intimately connected. When visceral fat is excessive, it fuels inflammation in the intestinal lining. This inflammation weakens the gut barrier, allowing bacterial products like lipopolysaccharides to leak into the bloodstream. This is what we call metabolic endotoxemia, and it quietly drives insulin resistance, immune activation, and chronic disease. As visceral fat shrinks, that inflammatory pressure eases. The gut lining begins to heal. Tight junctions between intestinal cells strengthen. Fewer toxins escape into circulation. The immune system, which is heavily stationed in the gut, becomes less reactive and more regulated. This shift has profound consequences. Inflammatory. The first internal sign fat is finally burning markers drop further. Autoimmune flares often soften, joint pain improves, skin conditions calm down. These are not separate problems being fixed one by one. They are downstream effects of reducing a central inflammatory source. At the same time, the gut microbiome begins to change. A healthier metabolic environment favors beneficial bacteria that produce short-chain fatty acids like butyrate. These compounds nourish the gut lining, reduce inflammation, and even improve insulin sensitivity. The gut stops acting like a battlefield and starts behaving like a well-governed ecosystem. Now let's talk about the brain, because this is where many people notice the most surprising changes. Visceral fat communicates with the brain through hormones, inflammatory signals, and the vagus nerve. When visceral fat is high, the brain is constantly bombarded with stress signals. This contributes to mental fog, anxiety, low mood, and even depression. When visceral fat begins to melt away, those signals quiet down. Ketones become an alternative fuel for the brain, providing steady energy without glucose spikes. Brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF, increases. This supports neuron health, plasticity, and cognitive clarity. Patients often tell me they feel sharper. They describe a calm focus that they haven't felt in years. This is not a placebo, it is biology. The brain is finally receiving the message that the internal environment is safe and stable. The immune system also recalibrates. Visceral fat constantly stimulates immune cells, keeping them in a low-grade activated state. Over time, this leads to immune exhaustion and inappropriate inflammation. As visceral fat declines, immune cells shift from attack mode to repair mode. Inflammation becomes purposeful instead of chronic. Mitochondria, the energy factories inside your cells, also begin to recover. Chronic inflammation damages mitochondria and reduces metabolic flexibility. When inflammation falls and ketones rise, mitochondria become more efficient. The body regains the ability to switch between fuels smoothly like a hybrid engine rather than a broken gas-only system. This is what I mean when I say visceral fat loss is a metabolic revolution. It is not about shrinking fat cells. It is about restoring communication between organs, hormones, insulin, the gatekeeper of visceral fat and cells. Here's the important part. All of this happens before dramatic weight loss occurs. That's why focusing only on the scale misses the real story. The most meaningful changes are happening internally, quietly, but powerfully. Comment below the word metabolic revolution if you want me to cover more topics on metabolic health. And if you're enjoying the value so far, share this lecture with your family and friends and leave me a like on this video. This will tell YouTube that this video is informative and worth pushing more. Now I want to talk about rhythm, because visceral fat does not respond well to force, but it responds beautifully to timing. You cannot bully visceral fat into submission with willpower, extreme calorie cutting, or endless cardio. Visceral fat is hormonally protected, and it only releases when the body senses safety, consistency, and metabolic balance. Think of your body as a city with a central government. Hormones are the laws. When those laws are chaotic, no department functions properly. Visceral fat thrives in chaos. Irregular eating, late-night meals, poor sleep, and chronic stress all send the same signal to the body. Resources are unpredictable. Danger is near. Hold on to energy at all costs. The moment you restore rhythm, everything changes. When you create consistent fasting windows, insulin begins to fall. Predictably, that drop in insulin is not dramatic at first, but it is steady. Over time, the body learns that it does not need to keep glucose constantly available. Fat vaults begin to open, and visceral fat is the first place the body looks because it is metabolically active and easy to access. Once insulin resistance starts reversing, sleep is the next pillar. Poor sleep raises cortisol, and cortisol tells visceral fat to stay exactly where it is. When you start sleeping well, especially aligning sleep with circadian rhythms, cortisol normalizes, melatonin rises appropriately, growth hormone pulses at night, and growth hormone is one of the most powerful visceral fat mobilizing signals we have. This is why people who fix their sleep often see belly fat shrink even without changing much else. The body finally enters what happens inside your liver, first repair mode at night instead of staying in survival mode. Stress management is just as critical. I cannot overstate this. Psychological stress directly increases gut permeability, raises inflammatory cytokines, and drives visceral fat accumulation. The vagus nerve acts like a communication highway between the brain and the gut. When stress dominates, that highway transmits danger signals non-stop. When you reduce stress through breath work, time in nature, social connection, or even simple daily walks, the vagus nerve shifts into a parasympathetic state. This tells the body it is safe to repair. Visceral fat receives that message clearly. Food quality matters too, but not in the way people think. Visceral fat is less concerned with calories and more concerned with signals. Ultra-processed foods generate inflammation, disrupt gut bacteria, and spike insulin. Whole foods do the opposite. Fiber feeds beneficial bacteria, improves gut integrity, and reduces endotoxin leakage. That alone lowers inflammatory pressure on visceral fat stores. This is why I emphasize real food, not just low-carb or low-calorie labels. The gut and liver are listening to what you eat, not just how much. As visceral fat continues to break down under these conditions, leptin sensitivity improves. The brain begins to hear fullness signals again. Hunger becomes appropriate rather than constant. Grain rhythms normalize. You stop thinking about food all day long. At the same time, adiponectin rises. This hormone enhances insulin sensitivity and fat oxidation. It is one of the quiet heroes of metabolic health, and visceral fat suppression allows it to rise naturally. The remarkable thing is that none of this feels like suffering. When biology is working with you, effort decreases, energy increases, cravings fade, motivation returns, not through discipline, but through alignment. This is the difference between fighting your body and leading it. Now, I want to address a common misconception. Many people think that losing visceral fat is about eating less and moving more. I want to explain why inflammation drops before weight loss, that oversimplification fails so many people, and what actually makes visceral fat retreat for good. One of the biggest misunderstandings about visceral fat is the belief that it disappears the same way subcutaneous fat does. That idea has caused decades of frustration. People eat less, exercise more, lose weight on the scale, and yet the belly remains firm, the liver stays fatty, the inflammation markers stay elevated, and metabolic disease continues quietly in the background. Tell me in the comments if you used to think the same. Share your thoughts and experience. It will help others. Now, this happens because visceral fat does not respond to calorie counting. It responds to hormonal permission. When you simply reduce calories without fixing insulin resistance, the body interprets that as threat. Metabolism slows, cortisol rises, muscle is broken down. Visceral fat, which is seen as a critical energy reserve, protecting vital organs, becomes even more guarded. This is why aggressive dieting often worsens metabolic health over time. What actually removes visceral fat is restoring insulin sensitivity. Insulin is the gatekeeper. As long as insulin remains elevated, visceral fat is locked away. When insulin falls and stays low for long enough, the locks open. This is where fasting becomes powerful. Not because it starves the body, but because it removes constant insulin signaling between meals, especially during extended overnight fasts. Insulin finally has the chance to drop to baseline. Fat can be accessed. Inflammatory signals decline. The liver begins exporting fat instead of storing it. Over time, the liver itself changes. Fatty liver reverses. Hepatic insulin sensitivity improves. Glucose output, gut healing, and immune system reset becomes more controlled. Triglycerides fall. Small dense LDL particles decrease. Not because cholesterol was targeted, but because inflammation was reduced at its source. This is a critical point. Visceral fat loss improves cardiovascular risk long before dramatic weight loss occurs. Blood pressure improves, endothelial function recovers, C-reactive protein falls. These are real measurable changes that reflect internal healing. The gut plays an equally important role. Visceral fat is closely tied to gut inflammation and dysbiosis. When the gut lining is compromised, lipopolysaccharides leak into the bloodstream, triggering immune activation and fat storage in visceral depot. When fasting and whole food nutrition restore gut integrity, endotoxin load drops, immune activation quiets. Visceral fat no longer receives the signal to expand as a protective buffer against inflammation. As this happens, mitochondrial function improves. Cells regain the ability to switch between glucose and fat efficiently. This is metabolic flexibility. Without it, visceral fat accumulates. With it, visceral fat becomes unnecessary. Many people describe this phase as a turning point. Energy becomes stable throughout the day. Brain fog lifts, exercise feels easier, recovery improves. These are not psychological effects. They are biochemical consequences of reduced visceral inflammation. Importantly, this process cannot be rushed. Visceral fat accumulated over years of metabolic stress. It unwinds gradually as safety signals replace danger signals. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. Eating windows that respect circadian biology, movement that enhances insulin sensitivity rather than exhausts the system, sleep that allows hormonal repair, stress reduction that calms the immune response. When these conditions are met, visceral fat has no reason to stay. If you're still here watching this lecture, please go ahead and comment below the word "I'm listening," and I'll know how many of my viewers, brain clarity, energy, and calm focus, respect my efforts and listen to me till the end. And if you're enjoying the value so far, please hit that like button and share this lecture with your family and friends who might be suffering from visceral fat. Now, I want you to understand something very important here, because this is where the entire conversation about visceral fat changes from frustration to clarity. Visceral fat is not your enemy. It is a response. It is the body adapting to years of signals that told it the environment was hostile, unpredictable, and inflammatory. When I see patients with large amounts of visceral fat, I don't see laziness or lack of discipline. I see a nervous system that has been on high alert for too long. I see a liver that has been overwhelmed. I see a gut that has been leaking inflammatory signals into the bloodstream. And I see hormones that have been forced into survival mode. Visceral fat develops to protect vital organs from that chaos. The body is always choosing survival over aesthetics. Always. So when visceral fat finally begins to break down, what you are witnessing is not just fat loss. You are witnessing a biological truce. The body is saying, I no longer need this emergency buffer. That shift begins internally. Insulin resistance improves not because calories were slashed, but because insulin finally has time to fall. Cortisol quiets down because sleep improves and stress signals decrease. Adipon rises, improving fat metabolism and insulin sensitivity. Leptin begins to work again, allowing the brain to sense fullness and energy sufficiency. At the same time, inflammation markers drop. Tumor necrosis factor alpha declines. Interleukin 6 decreases. C reactive protein improves. These are not abstract concepts. These are the laboratory fingerprints of healing. As inflammation resolves, the brain benefits too. Neuroinflammation declines. Blood flow improves. Many people notice reduced anxiety, better mood, sharper focus. This makes sense. Why forcing fat loss backfires? Because visceral fat-driven inflammation does not stay confined to the abdomen. It affects the brain, the heart, the joints, and the immune system. The gut microbiome also shifts. Beneficial bacteria flourish when insulin spikes are reduced and fiber intake improves. Short-chain fatty acids increase. The gut lining strengthens. Endotoxin leakage decreases. Once again, visceral fat no longer needs to act as a firewall against inflammatory assault. This is why people often say something just clicked. Their habits may not have changed dramatically, but their biology did. And here's the part I want you to remember. You cannot force this process through suffering. Excessive restriction, overtraining, poor sleep, and constant stress all delay visceral fat loss. They tell the body that danger still exists. What accelerates visceral fat loss is consistency and safety, regular fasting windows, whole foods, movement that improves insulin, sensitivity, sleep that restores hormonal balance, stress reduction that calms the nervous system. This is not about perfection. It is about signals. Every day, your body is asking one question. Is it safe to let go? When you answer that question consistently with your lifestyle, visceral fat begins to melt away quietly, steadily, and permanently. Let me leave you with the most important takeaway of all, because if you understand this, everything else falls into place. Visceral fat does not disappear because you punish your body. It disappears because you restore order. For years, modern life has disrupted our biological rhythm. We eat constantly, sleep poorly, sit indoors, live under chronic stress, and consume foods our biology does not recognize. Visceral fat forms as a shield against that chaos. It restores rhythm. Don't punish your body is the body adapting, not failing. When you reverse that environment, the body responds with remarkable intelligence. Create space between meals and insulin falls. Sleep deeply and cortisol quiets. Eat real food and inflammation declines. Move regularly and insulin sensitivity improves. Reduce stress and the nervous system shifts from survival to repair. When these signals align, visceral fat is no longer needed. This is why sustainable visceral fat loss looks almost boring from the outside. There is no extreme dieting, no obsession with calories, no endless hours of cardio, yet internally, there is a profound metabolic revolution taking place. The liver unloads stored fat and regains metabolic flexibility. The gut seals itself and stops leaking inflammatory toxins. Mitochondria regain efficiency. Hormones recalibrate. The brain clears its fog. The immune system quiets down. This is not cosmetic change. This is biological rebuilding. And the beauty of it is that your body already knows how to do this. You don't need to teach it. You just need to stop interfering with it. Fasting windows, whether modest or extended, give insulin time to fall and fat time to be accessed. Good sleep allows growth hormone to repair tissues. Stress reduction removes the hormonal handcuffs from fat loss. Whole foods provide the raw materials for healing without triggering inflammation. When biology starts working for you instead of against you, visceral fat resolves as final takeaway, real metabolic healing a consequence, not a goal. If you focus only on the mirror or the scale, you miss the deeper victory. The real win is when your blood markers improve, your energy stabilizes, your mind clears, and your health risks decline. That is when you know visceral fat is truly breaking down. So don't chase fat loss. Restore rhythm, restore safety, restore nourishment. Your body will take care of the rest. If you've completed the lecture today, go ahead and tell me what was the best learning you've taken today. And if you still haven't, tap that subscribe button and leave me a like on this lecture. Thank you very much for listening to me till the end. I really appreciate your attention and love towards me. Please take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next lecture.